Good afternoon, everyone. Once again, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to a presentation of our South Brunswick History series. This is the third in 5, and I'm surprised that we're here already. My name, for those of you who are here for the first time, is Ellen Gambatese. And if you recognize the name, because my husband is the deputy mayor, that is what brought me here. Frank is a member of the Historical Preservation Society committee here in South Brunswick, and he kept coming home telling me of all these wonderful presentations and all of these very knowledgeable people, and the educator in me said, we have to get this information out to a broader public, so let's do it. Being on the library board, I asked them if they would mind if we did this through the library, and they were very, very open to the idea. So here we are. We have 2 more to go, and the 2 that we've had have been wonderful. Today's promises to be wonderful, and I hope to see you back for the other 2. I would like to thank the library board for its permission to let us use the facility. I would like to thank Ken Kirsch and his assistants, Joe Bonci and Tasso Stefanidis, for recording this for us, because eventually it will be shown on Channel 3, and I think that's a big plus for our township. I would like to thank the Friends of the Library for providing refreshments for us. I would like to thank you for showing your interest and keeping us encouraged. And I would like to thank our presenters. Before I present them, though, I just would like to make an apology, because when we had the Kingston presentation 2 weeks ago, I gave credit to George Luck for putting up the signs indicating where the Revolutionary Army marched through Kingston on its way to Monmouth, and that was a mistake. It was really Charlie Dietrich who did that, and they wouldn't let me correct it that day. So I have to correct it now so the community knows. And also I apologize to Jim Boyd for mispronouncing his name. He is the gentleman who was so very good about doing the Kingston videotape. Today, we have more talented and knowledgeable people, which the longer I live in South Brunswick, the more I'm finding we have in numerous amounts. We are a bedroom community of Rutgers and Princeton University, and that is an advantage to us because we have so very many talented and knowledgeable people. Our first presenter will be Dr. Richard Ilnicki, and I know Dick Ilnicki because he was president of the library board when I was appointed, and he has been a member of the library board since the library began in South Brunswick, and it is a part of his heart, let me tell you. But that's not his only thing. Dr. Ilnicki is a retiree of Cook College, Rutgers University, and he is an agronomist, and he knows a great deal about the particular soil of South Brunswick. And it's my understanding that that's why Cook College is located so near, because we are such fertile ground and have so much to offer. But Dr. Ilnicki will tell us more about that. We also have Dr. Joan Luckhart, and those of you who were here for the first presentation already know her. Dr. Luckhart is not only a historian, very, very interested in preserving Dayton's history. She's part of the Dayton Coalition. In fact, she's the president. But she is the one who came to the council and asked them to help save the Slack House, which is on George's Road next to the Wawa. It didn't look like much because of all the years of renovations that had been done to it, but she knew that its heart was the house that belonged to Dr. Slack and Dr. Carroll, and Dr. Slack was very prominent in the Civil War as a surgeon. So that's part of our history. And we have 2 other people with us today. Speaking of the Civil War, we're very happy to bring to you 2 Civil War reenactors, and they are inhabitants of Dayton, Don and Ellen Weber, and they're going to tell us how Dayton and Deans figured into the Civil War. But I can tell you that in my docent training at the State House in New Jersey, I learned, maybe you know this already, but I learned that when President Lincoln was elected, and he left from Illinois to go to Washington, D.C., he took a train that brought him by way of various states, including New Jersey, and he asked for those states to help him in his quest to preserve the Union. Because between the time he was elected and the time he was sworn in March in those days, there had been some secessions, and the Union was threatened. So Abraham Lincoln was here asking for help. And I'm sure that Ellen and Don are going to tell us how we in South Brunswick were a great part of that help. I know that New Jersey sent the first soldiers, so I'm sure they'll tell you more. With that, I turn the program over to Dr. Richard Ilnicki, and enjoy, folks.
I had prepared a set of Kodachromes for the presentation today, and I checked with my professional consultant, my dear wife over there, Helen Ilnicki. She says, maybe it'd be better rather than slides is talk sort of freely, and you can add more things or delete things and so forth. So I took her advice, and I usually don't use cards because they told us when you want to give a talk, you write it out, but then you don't read it. But this is just to remind me what I should talk about because I can get carried away. The title, when I was approached by Ellen, I guess several months ago, to talk about agriculture. So I've entitled this A Historical Look of Agriculture at South Brunswick. It's not sectionally to Dayton at all or Deans, but it's the South Brunswick. I'm thinking more in terms of the whole township. Well, let's go back with regard to agriculture to the early settlers. And they were the Lenni the Lenape Indians that were part of the Delaware tribe. They weren't very numerous and they weren't warlike. And as a matter of fact, they were assisted our early settlers, in South Brunswick townships. They were of really good neighbors and good contacts. Plus the fact that they introduced us to maize, or as we know it, corn, squash, and some other crops, some of the grains and so forth that our early colonists, early settlers were able to use. With regard to their culture, their agricultural techniques were rather crude, primitive. Their fields were small, but nevertheless they did make some contribution to South Brunswick Township agriculture in New Jersey in particular. Later settlers came in and they were good neighbors to the Indians, or the Native Americans, I should say, to our early settlers. Well, what was the complexion of our early settlers? Well, we had Czechs, we had Slovaks, Hungarians from Eastern Europe, Italians, and Ukraine. And as a matter of fact, you run through some of the cemeteries here in Dayton that I know of, and you can see ethnic names, which were all part of the glorious history of South Brunswick. And they were very, very important in the development of our town. Now, what were some of the early crops that were grown? Wheat, both fall sown and spring, used for grain, and also used for a cover crop because our soils are a little on the light side here in texture, and I'll tell you a little bit more about them. Oats, we for grain, and also as feed for horses. We didn't have big JIK's tractors or farmwall. We had horsepower, and of course you had to feed the horses and so forth. Rye, used as a cover crop also and as a grain, and also maize or corn, which was indigenous to the New World. Corn or maize, as it's sometimes called, I guess in the scientific circle, but we know it as good old corn. When Ellen talked to me, she says, why was agriculture so important? And why did it come here? Why did it settle? Well, I think maybe if we consider several aspects of the environment, now we'll know a little bit more about why it was so important and why it was such a part of our way of life. Well, first of all, we're located on the coastal plain. Coastal plain, if you draw a line from New Brunswick down to Trenton, anything south of that is known as the coastal plain. Light soils, rather level in topography, very good agriculturally, and above that, of course, other provinces would be the Piedmont area, the Valley and Ridge, and the Highlands as we go from south to north. But this is one of the factors that contribute to the good agriculture and to the posterity and prosperity of South Brunswick. So we were part of the coastal plain, which is a very, very important part of the environment and important to the agriculture here in South Brunswick. What also makes so good with regard to the environment? Land drainage. Here, just a little ways up the road, we have Heathcote Brook, which flows eventually into Mill Pond and so forth. That serves as a good drainage area. In the south of us, Devil's Brook off of Culver Road and Heathcote. And they actually eventually ended up into the Millstone River. So you see, it was necessary to have good drainage as well as good soils. And then north of here, of course, was Ireland Brook, which also served as a boundary between South Brunswick and East Brunswick. Part of the land drainage system. You see what our neighbors in the Midwest are experiencing now, even with the great tributary or the great river of Mississippi. If you don't get that water off fast, you're not going to be able to survive. Fortunately, it was one of the strong points of New Jersey, South Brunswick agriculture, was its soils and also its drainage. So we might say then that South Brunswick is in the coastal plain area, which is in topography rather flat, but still the soils were porous enough and friable enough where we got good drainage, and that this drainage water was able to come off of it off after a sudden rain and so forth and get on the land. I remember when I went to school in the Midwest, went to a field trip to Illinois, heavy soils of the Midwest, 4 to 6 point percentage organic matter, clay, but they were heavy soils. And I remember coming back to my major professor, and I was really flabbergasted by the heavy soils there, the good soils. And he said to me, Ilnicki, he says, where you come from, you have some of the best soils in the world. He said, they respond to fertility. After a big heavy rain, a day or two you can get on. Whereas we in the Midwest, they're going to have a really late spring there in the Midwest because of those heavy soils. And once the water is drained off, it's going to take a long time for them to dry. If I could use another story about the Midwest soils or the heavy. When they dried out in the summer, they would crack. And the story goes that a farmer was making an adjustment on his plow, and he dropped the wrench. And he fell down in a crack. He said, well, I guess I'll go get lunch while I'm here. And he had his lunch, came back and put his head to the ground, and that wrench was still bouncing from side to side on its way down. We don't have that problem here in South Brunswick. So we have blessed with good soils. Climate, excellent climate. Another aspect of the environment which is very conducive to good agriculture here in South Brunswick. A lot of people think that we have a maritime climate. We really don't. We have a continental type. Our weather's just a short strip along the long coastline that we have is influenced by the oceanic breezes and so forth, but it's really, we are a continental type of climate. And why we're also so good too, you stop and think, and climatologists tell us that in New Jersey here, South Brunswick particularly, that we have, of the days of the year, we have 1/3 full sunshine, 1/3 cloudy or rain, and the other third partly cloudy, that is with some sun. When you consider that we have these weather that comes from the south in the summertime, it brings us that hot weather and gives us the sou'westers, as we call them, and one from the northwest or northeast, which gives us our nor'easters, and then we have the continental. These are things that we have to live with, and we adapted ourselves to them, but they're really positive parts of the environment of South Brunswick. So then we are a continental type, which is very, very conducive to the agriculture that we had here. You can see I'm not used to talking with cards. What is so good about with regard to the climate here in South Brunswick? We have 240 days of the growing season. beginning now, April to early October. And out of those 240 days, only 70 of those, I should have 240 days frost-free, but only about 70 days. 70 days of those are which we have to be concerned with regard to freezing temperatures, killing frost and so forth. But 240 days, that's better than the Northwest, than the Midwest. So that was another positive aspect of why agriculture was so sound and good here in South Brunswick. I like to leave you with a little saying, because I'm talking about soils and climate and water and so forth, that whatever his artistic accomplishments may be, man owes his very existence to 6 inches of topsoil and the fact that it rains. The professor gave that saying to me a long time ago. I can't remember which one it was. I know where I got it from, but he didn't know where it came from originally. That we have, whatever his artistic accomplishments may be, 6 inches of topsoil and the fact that it rains has given us our strength. And we have that here at South Brunswick. Just made and the fact we have about 40 inches of rain a year right here in South Brunswick. And about 10 to 15 thunderstorms, which gave to the water to us. And even occasionally, we welcomed hurricanes as long as they weren't too devastating, because even though we might have a dry period in June and July, maybe to early August, sometimes these hurricanes were welcome. That's to provide they weren't raised that much havoc with our physical structure. So you see, those are important aspects. Water, soils, climate were very good for agriculture. What was the main crop? You know, in the spring of the year, I remember when I was a kid, the fields there in early June were white with potato blossoms. White potatoes, or we call them Irish potatoes, with 9,000 acres, South Brunswick, Cranberry, Monroe, Plainsboro. We had about 80,000 acres in the whole state of New Jersey, and it was a prominent crop here. And we still have vestiges of old distributors, Bennett and Clayton and Dayton, Simons and Mount on 130 just south Cranberry. And then we go to some of these others that supplied seed and fertilizer, and then when our growers harvested them, they take them to the same place and they would be shipped out. Plus the fact that some of the farmers would actually go to market itself. I know when I was our farm, we either went to Perth Amboy or Newark. We came from a diversified farm on Fresh Ponds Road. So we were also blessed by the physical aspects. Philadelphia to the south, New York City to the northeast, Newark to the north, and east here, Perth Amboy. They all had markets in which distributors would come and take our products. And and I know that was very, very important. But potatoes didn't last too long, maybe 75 years, 100 years. And there was a reason for it. And I like to quote one of our deans, former deans, saying why the reason for potato decline. That popular consumption has it that potatoes and romance are not compatible. Because with potatoes, you develop a avoirdupois, and with avoirdupois, you lose romance. But that's a misconception, because average sized potato, the size of an apple, had the same amount of calories. But you know what makes the potatoes? We should know this. That's the butter, the sour cream, salt, And to this day, I still enjoy a potato, whether it's be mashed or baked or whatever it might be. And one of the important crops right here in South Brunswick, unfortunately, we don't have. I think maybe Bobby Montoon maybe grows a little bit. Then another industry was very popular here, again related to the soils, was the poultry industry. And this was particularly with the Jewish people along Davison Mill Road, which we know as Cottageville. And I asked some of those people, why did you get into poultry? Well, I guess some of their dietary aspects, but the fact is that a lot of those immigrants came from areas that were persecuted, and they just didn't have much land. So, they didn't need much land for a chicken coop. So we had most farmers had small flocks, and they also had all the way up to 10,000 acres. Hudak's on Fresh Ponds Road, George Siegel on Davison Mill Road. Some people here in Dayton, you still see old chicken coops left. That was important industry. What happened to that industry? Again, overproduction, low prices, cost of feed was high, and machinery was high. We say, what do you need in machinery? Well, automatic feeders, and also to collect the eggs. If you had 10,000 hens, you can't go around, picking up that many eggs every day from that number. So you had to become mechanized. Those costs became so prohibitive that the industry kind of petered out. As a matter of fact, there was at one time interest in New Jersey here of changing the famed Garden State name to the Egg State. Could you imagine that, if that became the Egg State? We'd be a bunch of eggheads, to the rest of the world. But thank goodness we held on to that Garden State, and we still are. So that was the reason why that industry went out. Dairy. Almost every farm, in addition to having a little flock of chickens for his eggs, had a cow for his milk, for their milk and for their cheese. But we did have some good farms, dairy farms. Prine, over off of Ridge Road, south of here. Ryan's, a sweet clover farm on Fresh Ponds Road. People in the southern area of the town sold their milk to Forest Gate Farms. Forest Gate Farm didn't grow all their milk, so we did have dairy as an important aspect. The Siegels on South River Cranberry Road. A lot of those didn't market process their milk. They sold it to processors. Only one I knew in this town was probably Ryan's over on on Fresh Ponds Road, near where Bill Griffin's nursery is today. And then, of course, the vegetables. This soil is so good. It came from the sassafras, sandy loam soils that were, let's say, very friable, evenly textured, responded to fertility and to water, and it was great for vegetables. And I mentioned the markets before, and there were some good vegetable growers. Eddie Vasinski, who used to be on the township committee years ago, there off of Stouts Lane, grew some excellent vegetables. But nowadays, we have more or less, rather than shipping to points of distribution, we're going to the roadside market. Although we have Claire's now, the market there on South River Cranberry Road, they did not really raise all the vegetables. When George Siegel was there, they grew a lot of them. So you see, we have something to be very proud of. His history was unique and phenomenal. Those reasons why we had such good agriculture was position, topography, condition of the soil, rains, the distribution of rains, and I say marketing. These all lend. And this soil is still so productive that even though we don't have potatoes or chickens or vegetables, it grows houses and apartments like mad. I thank you for your attention, and we'll forget about the quiz.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dick. Is this on, Tessa? Thank you very much. I just have to say, Dick, that all the wonderful soil must be on the east side of town, because where we live on the west side of town, we have mustard yellow clay about 4 inches underneath that brown stuff. And you must have it all. Sure.
You're getting out of the coastal plain area and into the Piedmont, and that's where the soils are a little heavier. And I failed to mention orchards. We did have some good orchards in this, and usually they were on land that was not too good for vegetables or potatoes. John Barkley on Dye Road, Burley Driggers there on Stouts Lane, right over here in Dayton, where those Fresh Pond apartments are, Headley orchards. Some of those lands were a little heavier, so they weren't very good for vegetables, but these ingenious growers who knew how to handle plants would put it to good use and grow the crop in which they would get their greatest return.
Thanks. Today's focus is on Dayton Deans. And we talked in our first presentation, Ruth Spataro did that wonderful map of South Brunswick and how the old Indian trails ultimately became our major roads. And at one juncture between George's Road and Ridge Road, it was called Crossroads. And for those of you who watch our township committee meetings, you'll see the logo in back of the township council all the time. And I wondered, Tasso, can you get a picture of this logo, and on the seal, on the logo, you will see that it says South Brunswick Crossroads of Progress. We have the term crossroads a lot in referring to South Brunswick. And if you can see the 4 quarters there, the upper left quadrant has rifles crossed, and that stands for the history that we were involved in and with. And to the right of that is a plowshare, which needs no explanation after Dr. Ilnicki's presentation. Underneath the plowshare on the lower left, lower right, is a symbol that stands for industry, and to the left of that is the symbol that stands for research, because that's what's going on in South Brunswick today, the research and the industry, and unfortunately the farming is not as dominant as it used to be. Although after hearing Dr. Ilnicki, I'm kind of sorry about that. And my husband tells me that the township administration would really like to make some kind of a farm preservation in the township somewhere. And he's sitting in the room right now, and I would like to hold him to that and say, let's get moving on it, because I don't like too far in the future. Excuse me? About a museum of sorts, yes. Within a month or so, we will be hearing more about a museum having to do with farm preservation, farming. And will it utilize some of the existing buildings that are left? And you are looking for donations of old farm equipment? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Maybe there are others. He says there are many people in town who would like to donate old farm equipment, which is good. And much of it has been donated to Cook College already, right, Dick? Yes, the Farm Museum at Cook College mostly holds what was donated to them by South Brunswick residents. Dr. Joan Lockhart, a recent retiree of the University of Medicine and Dentistry, where she was director of the Poison Prevention and Education Center. And one of her big interests is in water. And you'll see her up at the podium at the council meeting sometime, because she's very concerned about our aquifer and what goes into it. That's one of her many, many interests. Now she is going to talk to us about Crossroads and what it is. No. And neither can the equipment.
How's this? Okay, I didn't have the switch on. There are 3 buttons on it. Nope, I didn't. I turned it off. Every time I put it in my pocket, I will be turning it off. I'm trying very desperately to not turn it off. There we are. Well, I'm going to do this. I'm going to give you little housekeeping details. First of all, I have a portable computer on which are these slideshows that were taken with digital cameras. The downside of it is the portable only allows me to, because it doesn't have a lot of memory, to only put so many slides in at a time. So it's broken into 5 parts, and it'll be I'll have to stop and go to the next slideshow every time the memory gets full. So I'm pre-warning you. The second item is that we'll have a break, but we're lucky to have our Civil War and reenactors who will give us some more information also about Deans, since they're both were raised in Deans. And the part I wanted to mention was that I need to thank Ellen Gambatis for organizing this whole series of programs. It's been a delight to be a part of it, and she's the most professional and thorough organizer I've ever worked with. It's been quite a thrill. And I also want to thank Seal Edom for being the township historian and so helpful in getting materials on each of the towns. It's amazing what she has put into our South Brunswick Library. It's a wonderful resource, and I thank you for that. And I also need to thank Frank Gambatis, that without that committee that's looking at our history, we probably wouldn't have thought about it as deeply as we've begun to. And we certainly wouldn't have been collecting artifacts of our history and sharing them. It's been a wonderful experience to have people share their memories of and things that they've collected over a lifetime. To that point, there's a basket over by the refreshments tables, and when we take a break, there's sheets of paper in there for you to either take home or to fill out while you're having your refreshments, called memories. And I would very much like you to share your memories of South Brunswick with us and leave them for us to put into a book. And just reminiscences, small memories of the way things were. This part of South Brunswick, the Dayton and Deans area, was settled a little later, I think, than the Kingston area was. It was said people got off at Perth Amboy, and they came west. And when they saw a pleasant piece of property for farming, they stopped and they settled there. And many of them came along the Indian trails. And you'll see those remnants of trails have now turned into roads. Dayton was settled about 1685 and Deans around 1695. But the Road Hall area was settled about that time. So many of the places that now we don't even notice as a name were settled as people stopped and started their farming. But Crossroads, which is what Dayton was known as up until 1866, was Crossroads because there were so many of the roads that converged there, making it a prime location for taverns. I'm going to be bouncing between the screen and my computer. We've talked about the Delaware and the agricultural qualities of the township, which made it unique. And those of us who garden in Dayton and Deans are blessed with soil that allows us to pull out dandelions without a tool in many cases. But some of the spelling was very creative in colonial periods, so you'll see these names spelled in many different ways, and part of it is I found out I couldn't even read my own writing, so that got very creative on some of these slides. The taverns, the Whitlock Tavern, and the Wetherells, John Wetherell, Thomas Wetherell, opened taverns as well because of this crossroads phenomena. The Whitlock Tavern, you may, some of you who have been in South Brunswick for some time may remember it as Fat Eddie's Groaning Board. Or you may have more lately known it as the Dayton Diner Family Restaurant, or Cayenne, or about to be the Dayton Express. But this is a brick structure, the oldest building in our township, built in 1732. George Washington stopped here and waft down a few pints on his way to the Monmouth battlefield. And there's apparently even a bill that he paid to the tavern owner. And the soldiers would have marched up what we now call Ridge Road and then down George's Road on their way to the battlefield in the summer of, one of the historians may help me on the date of that, 1778. The kitchen still is there, but this tavern was joined by the Wetherell's Tavern, called the Wines Tavern, Exchange Hotel, the Dayton Hotel. And the Wetherells owned a great deal of property in the late 1700s, early 1800s, building this plantation in the early 1800s. As I understand, they had a nursery here, renowned enough that botanists from England stopped to collect samples. They also had a brick yard where they made bricks out of the clay pits that they found. There were some clay pits in various parts of South Brunswick. But I think the one they used most often was up near the crossroads, about 100 feet away from the center of the crossroads. And I'm told by Seal Edom that this was built in sections. But in many cases, you'll find these houses, historical houses, were built as the families grew or as they gained more money. This map, you'll see the list of the residents. I believe this was early 1800s map. Was this about early 1800s? And at this point, we've got the oh, this is the 76 one, and I'm going to put the 72 one on later. But you'll notice that the names of the roads are different than they are today. And indeed, you can get very confused when you read history books because Crossroads is not Dayton. And you'll find that the place names are saying, this is Culver Road, was then known as Plainsboro Road. But you'll notice they spelled it a little differently than we do today. This was the Cranberry and New Brunswick Turnpike, and that was indeed a toll road. It was also later known as Main Street, and was also then, now we know it as George's Road. The road that we called Monmouth Junction Road, before we called it Ridge Road, was once known as Kingston Road. And then the other leg of it was then called Road Hall Road, but we now know it as Ridge Road. And you'll see that there are many farms that come off the center of town. But what changed Crossroads, and besides the fact that it was on all of these roads, was the trains came through. From the shore came the Jamesburg Freehold Road, Railroad that went on to Monmouth Junction. But there was also, according to some of the books I've read, a branch line from the Amboy Camden Railroad, which we now take Amtrak on, or not that track, but the same railroad line, that came by Dayton and also up to Deans. So there must have been a lot of rail traffic. And you can see the remnants of these roads, and then you can see how they sort of, the houses dotted along the major roads, and we filled them in over time with the structure still remaining. Okay, now this is where I have to go switching programs. At the at the end of the 1700s, we had grist mills, in the area with the Davidson Mill, up where Davidson Mill Pond Road, Park is. We had taverns. We had no churches. So we had a lot of drinkers, I guess. And we had a brickyard and a nursery. And we had some stores, mostly the stores in the houses. And we had county fair, which was sort of like a farmer's market. Where the Whitlock Tavern was, there was a farmer's market every Tuesday. So now we have a gap to some extent because we're going into about the Civil War and the post-Civil War period. And we have maybe about 35 dwellings in Dayton. By 1865, we've got 300 people living in Dayton, and in the township, about 3,700. So you can see Dayton had a small percentage of the whole, but it was certainly growing. And on this map, you can see that we've got, again, agriculturalists. And if you look at the names, both from the previous map and from this map, you'll find many of those names in the cemetery that is located in this area. On this map, you'll notice, this would be about 1872, I believe, is this map. You have two churches. The township committee was disturbed that there were no churches in the 1830s and 1840s. So they called a prayer meeting, which is something that the township committee would never do today. But at that time, they were distressed at perhaps the lack of civilizing influence on the town, and the Baptist missionary effort was formed, and there was a Baptist church raised on the site where the cemetery now stands. By 1869, the Presbyterian church was built. But you can see much more growth in this area. So this is about the way Dayton looked at the crossroads. This is looking up west on what we call Ridge Road. And this is where the video store now stands. But you'll see people built right up to the road, and that they were dirt roads in the late 1800s. This is the blacksmith shop in about 1850. The quality of the picture is much better than this. This is my digital camera's rendition of a postcard. But this is Mr., I think his name is Bastido, and his friends in front of his blacksmith shop, which stood on the corner near the Whitlock Tavern. His house still stands, but his shop has long since moved. And now I'm going to take you on a tour of some of the houses in this area after we look at the Dayton Post Office and store. Many stores serve multiple functions, such as store, general store, post office, and later gas station. And this would have been on George's Road. As I'd mentioned, the taverns were always important, and this became the Exchange Hotel, and then later Mr. Pindris bought it, and it became a more elaborate hotel, but it stood on the corner of George's Road and what we now know as Ridge Road, and eventually burnt down. But it served as a stopping off point for folks from New York who wanted to get some fresh air and visit the country. They also used this as a stop before they went to the shore.
So what corner would that have been on?
I think it stood probably where the dentist office now stands? I'm guessing, but that's my, is that about where? Yes, right where the north of the, but it's right about where the dentist office is in that whole area, because it took up a pretty big space. But there was Eli's store was there as well, I think. So this is Eli's General Store, and so I think that this burnt as well as the Exchange Hotel was the General Store, which was built on Georges Road. Now this is the houses today looking north on Georges Road. Remember, this would have been Main Street at one point. And this is where the Baptist church would have stood, and this is where the cemetery is. And if you take a nice walk, it's sort of like an our town kind of feeling to it. If you go through, you see many of the names of folks whose family were here for generations. I always like to stop by. And this was Rowland land. Rowlands are a prominent family in the town. And this was for a time was Eliza Rowland's house. And I assume she was the grandmother. And this house is built about 1850, I believe. And this house is built about 1903. And I assume this is was the son's house, and then he built a house next door for the daughter. When I moved in, we bought the house from the Knowles family, and you may all know Amanda Knowles, who lived in this house for approximately 50 years, and there's a scholarship named in her honor at the high school. She worked at, her husband, William Knowles, was a graduate in 1912 of Harvard and was an agronomist and taught at Cook. And he was an economist, largely was farm economist. Their son, Wendell Knowles, went to West Point and graduated from West Point. She worked at, Amanda worked at the Forest Gay Country Club and actually kept it in the black. She was their bookkeeper and talked them into opening up their dining room to the public, which kept them from going under, as I understand. And she was quite a lady because she would invite me she moved to Rossmore, and her children were very worried about her health because she was not one to sit still. And she took me blueberry picking because she liked blueberries. I was so tired. She was like in her 90s. And to keep up with her was a lot of work. There was a truck, and she really decided she'd rather walk than take the truck out to the fields. And I sort of had to persuade her. But the only way to persuade her was to tell her I was tired, which I was, and she would have walked to the fields and back with these blueberries. So quite a energetic woman all her life. So I hope that you can share some of those memories with us of residents. The church was built, part of its development was because of William Dayton, who the town then was named after in 1866. William L. Dayton may or may not have been the son of Joshua Dayton. Some of the books list Dayton in New Jersey being named after Jonathan Dayton. Jonathan Dayton was in the Civil War, a Revolutionary War hero. His father, Elias, was also a Revolutionary War hero. But the William L. Dayton ran in 1856 with Fremont on the presidential, he was the vice presidential candidate for that ticket. And they lost, that was the first Republican ticket, but it was an interesting ticket because they won so many votes that it convinced the South that they were going to go to war soon. And indeed, when the Republican ticket won in 1860 with Abraham Lincoln as president, that's precisely what happened. But Dayton William Dayton was a senator. He was sent to France by Lincoln. He then worked as a lawyer for the railroad. And when there was a dispute about putting the Jamesburg Freehold Railroad in, because it was going to go right over the location of the only school that Dayton had, he arranged to build the new school and to also contribute to the building of the Presbyterian Church. And that settled the town dispute. And Crossroads was always, people in Crossroads were always having their mail sent somewhere else. And they were very distressed that since there were so many crossroads in the state of New Jersey, they needed to make a change in the name. And they said they couldn't find a finer name to name it after than Dayton. And so that's what they did. But if you have any information about who William L. Dayton's parents were, it would be a big help. We've looked, and I have not found his history as yet. There are many lovely homes in Dayton that date to the 1800s, and this is one of them. And this is a 1900s home, and this is the Slack home. Slack House. Dr. Slack, Clarence Slack, was a naval surgeon in the Civil War. We've been able to we're trying to get his actual medical records, what he prescribed to the sailors on sea when he was at sea. But he opened, we think he built the house somewhere around certainly in the 1860s. This is the main part of the house, and this is an Italianate structure, and it's sort of the country doctor's home. Dr. Slack was here for about 20 years, and then he moved to New Brunswick where he opened a practice, and he became the first clerk of Middlesex County. He sold his practice and his house to Dr. Edgar Carroll, who served the community for about 45 years, dying in 1934. The most memorable comment, I thought, in his obituary was, of course, 1930s was the Great Depression, and many people in town owed Dr. Carroll much money for the services that he rendered over those 45 years. But because he was such a part of the community and cared so much about the families in the community, he asked his wife that when he died, that all those bills that were owed were to be marked paid in full. And I think that's an illustration of what being a real healer is. And I keep wondering if an HMO would have the same. But because you can see this is the part that Dr. Slack had, and we're busy redoing this. All of this tar paper is off of there. It had been covered with asbestos, by the way. And we were lucky in some ways. This was to be demolished. And if it wasn't for Frank Ambatisse and for a lot of help from the township, we would not have this house to even begin to look to make this a museum, which is what we're in the process of doing. Country Doctors and a Civil War Doctors Museum, and also a museum for Civil War artifacts. But this is the part that Dr. Carroll added from this vertical line this way. And he added some Queen Anne pieces. You'll see in the balustrade, some of the fancy balustrades were from Queen Anne period. But it's quite a sizable property, and you can see that we've got a lot of volunteers out there taking off the, this is Tim Freeman, I think, up on the ladder, who's here, and Bob Renovics, and Bob Tucker, and I think is this Hannah, or is that your mother, Hannah? That's your mom, okay. So there are a few folks here, and we're still taking the trees down, and if it wasn't for the 14th New Jersey Volunteers, Company K, we still have a lot of work to do, but with all the volunteers, we're moving ahead. I also want to thank the Girl Scout troop. I think it's 1782 which is the Girl Scout troop, is getting the paint for us. So they're working on getting the paint to paint the house. Okay, I have a few more minutes with one other slideshow. And we're going to look at the other part of Dayton and then Dean's. Okay, and the map again. We're going to be going we're going south on George's Road, and then we're going to go east on Ridge and then west. One of the things I wanted to mention was throughout Dayton, and it may be true of all South Brunswick, there seem to be many homes that are Sears catalog homes. And I have up here a display of some of the pictures from the catalog and also pictures of the houses. These were homes that were, 500,000 of these homes were sold in the nation, 100,000 of them by Sears. So there were other manufacturers who sold these kit houses. But because we were on a rail line, it was very easy for the entire house in 2 boxcars to arrive at the railroad and to be offloaded by the local contractor, who would then assemble them like a paint by numbers assembly. But for rural America, that Sears catalog, those Montgomery Ward catalogs, were a truly exciting way to make a contact with the rest of the world and to see what's available. So up here I ask you to not open it, but because the catalog's falling apart because there was a fire in one of the houses where it was housed. But there are pictures and pictures of the houses. Even brick houses would arrive in boxcar with all of the hardware, the doors, the windows, everything together, except for the foundation. So what we need to do, and this is one of the things you can help us with, is to see, is your house a Sears house? Check to see those beams would say Sears, or would say SR, I think, on some of the lumber. This is looking south on George's Road. You can see many of the houses were built in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Again, houses, the craftsman style. Some of the houses have been redone, and some of them you can see as original farmhouses, such as this one on Griggs and Ridge Road. Again, from the late 1800s, early 1900s, this is Ridge Road East. For those of you who are new to the township, this is the infamous Well 11 that was shut down because there was a leak of solvents in a huge tank under IBM plant, which is was up on Ridge Road. And there's an underground aquifer where the township used to draw its water. And they found the solvent in the water, and they had to shut this well down. And I think IBM spent millions of dollars over a 10-year period to pump the water out of the aquifer and aerate it so the solvent would dissipate. And here's some more. This is looking from the crossroads west. This is where the blacksmith's house was. The blacksmith shop was here, and to the right of it, on your side, was a tinsmith shop. This is now where the video store was, or is, but that's where that other house was that we looked at before. And here is Val and Barry Potts' house. This yellow house here was the first Western Union office in town. And there's a sign up there, and some of the glass caps that they used to use, I guess, wooden screws, and then they tied the lines around the top. But there's some pieces from that Western Union that are up on the table. We think this may be the tinsmith shop that got moved from the corner. I mention that because before electricity and all those lines all over the place, people moved buildings around a lot. But when there's lots of lines, telephone lines and electrical lines, the amount of moving the frequency of moving houses has diminished markedly. Along Ridge Road, going from Crossroads toward the municipal building, is the Pioneer Grange. This is the oldest continuing grange in New Jersey. It was chartered in 1871, and it has been ongoing since that point of time. The building was built in the 1900s, and they were to foster husbandry and share information and cooperation between people. And I think it did require women to be involved in the Grange, which is a terrific way that women were able to begin to participate in the economic life of the United States. And one of the things we always want to remember is this house is now gone. And it is to the credit of this is a beautiful home that it would have been nice if we could have saved it. And we're hoping that if we can save the rest of our heritage and find a way to make room for it in our lives today, that we have done a lot for South Brunswick history. I have one more slideshow, and it's very brief because we need more help to revive the history of Deans and some of these other crossroads, small towns throughout this area. Okay. Thanks for your patience, because this computers are great, but they're sometimes they're not as fast as I'd like them to be. And here we go. Takes a while to load. Deans was known as Martinsville. It was settled, as we know, in about 1695. And Davidson Mill was built in about 1785, which is about 100 years later. Can you see some of the, yeah. This is the railroad that really defined Deans, as did, it became a company town. That's where John Martin built a lot of the industry of the town. There was a toll gate, and I guess you're going to give some remembrances of your grandmother, Dawn. Dawn's grandmother was the toll taker of the this was the Cranberry, New Brunswick turnpike that ran through Dayton, but the toll was at Deans. It was noted as King George's Road? And there are many buildings along here. Now I'll do a picture of Dawn's house in a second. And there are many of the folks that lived here, but you can see the station was here, and you have the hay press, which was also, you'll find a hay press in Dayton as well, because that was much of the hay went to New York City. It's hard to know whether the computer is just waiting or I'm going to hit the wrong button. But this is the corner of, this is a Dean's Lane, and this is what we now know as George's Road. And this is where Dawn's family lived, yeah. And this is where was it Weber TV and Appliances, was for many years. And there's some beautiful homes along, and this is near Dean's Pond. Now, one of the things near the north, a little north of here of Dean's, is the Davis Mill Pond Park. If you haven't been there, it's a beautiful park. Near there is Pigeon Swamp, which in 1805 was all the time people were trying to drain this swamp. It's still a swamp. It was where the big ditch is. They've been trying to drain this. And we went up to see it, and there's the only thing that you find up there is the state Fish and Wildlife folks who won't let you go near it. I did drive in, but they don't let you go out. They were afraid you're going to get lost in the swamp. Now, by 1830s, a population of South Brunswick was about 2,500, but there was about 100 folks in Dean's at that point. Here's another really beautiful house in Dean's area on George's Road, near the pond. And there is a display with some of the pictures that Seal has collected. And again, they're another part of the farm area in Dean's. And now we have some industry as well, and this is the Rodner's contracting right next to the Dayton School. Yeah. But I'm going to we're going to do a break now, and I'm going to turn over the rest of the history of Dean's to two Dean's natives who know all about it and are also Civil War, who'll fill in the gaps about New Jersey's, South Brunswick folks in the Civil War. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joan. Before we break for tea and cookies, I would just like to show you a picture that we have on display here, and I'm hoping, Tasso, you can get this on camera. I hope that you noticed when Joan showed the slide of the Presbyterian Church in Dayton that to the side on the right was a little chapel. Well, we have a picture here of something that occurred in April of 1930 called a Tom Thumb wedding. And I heard Lou Schwartz say that he remembers when these occurred in his youth. But he's not the youth of fame in this picture. Can you get this, Tasso? We don't know who all the people are in the picture, and we're trying to find out. And one of our esteemed gentlemen in the room has found out about 11, I understand. But I have to tell you that he served as the minister in this ceremony, and the ceremony was held in the chapel of that Presbyterian church that we saw on the slide. And I don't know which one is the bride because of all the flowers, but I can tell you that Mr. Spataro is this one. Joe, am I right? Oh, this is the groom, but this is the presiding minister, Mr. Joseph Spataro. He's still preaching today. John Peccalone said, I don't consider it that, Joe. I think you did a good job. So do come up and see it and see our other displays. And don't forget, Dr. Ilnicki has some of the things that he found on his farm, Indian artifacts that he himself found on his properties in Dayton. They're authentic, they're ours, and they were found here. They weren't brought in. So we'll take a break now and enjoy. Also, I have some papers. If you weren't here for the Kingston presentation, I have some papers on Kingston, and I have some today on Dean's and the Wetherill Estate and the history of Dayton. I'll leave them on the table for you. What is it, hon? The tornado?
Are these your materials? No. Oh, okay.
Ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Thank you for your kind remarks during that break. And Dr. Lockhart told me that several of you are asking about an address so that you can send the page in for the memory book. And where are you, Joan? She disappeared? Oh, sorry about that. She offered that you could send it to her mailbox in Dayton, which is number 258, 258 Dayton, New Jersey. Dr. Joan Lockhart, L-U-C-K. Is that their box, 258? That would be the Dayton Citizens Coalition, and box number 258, Dayton, New Jersey. Okay, thank you very much for showing that interest. Before we proceed with the program, our township historian, Seal Leadham, has something that she would like to tell you before you leave the building.
Hello. I would just like to share with you the fact that out in the main part of the library, besides the display panels I put up on the various towns, just for Dayton and Deans, I put up a section that has the map from 1876 with a variety of homes that exist today with little lines showing you where they are in that 1876 map. And then I have out in the lobby an assortment of Dayton Dean's places which have either burnt down, been bulldozed down, or have been changed in some way since they were originally put together. And you can see an older picture of the Weber House from probably the 1800s. And I would like to also at this time, I have another display panel honoring Doris Curran of Dayton and William Baker of Deans. They were people who grew up in our township and did an awful lot of historical research that, as I come along and others of you share with you township information, we're building on what has happened in the past. Everyone contributes something that we learn more about the town. And I hope you all, if you have any corrections or additions, please feel free to make them because we're always learning something new. And I thank you very much for coming out today, learning more about Dayton and Deans.
Thanks, Seal. Seal has done a wonderful, wonderful job of pulling material out for us to use in our presentations and also for the display panels that she has out front. I also want to call to your attention that she did the work on the Wetherill history, which is on the back of your Dean's History paper that we gave out today. I really wish, Seal, that you had signed that so that we would know in the future that you worked on that, you did that work. Anybody who does these papers should sign them because we hope to make them part of our archives here in the library. And now, ladies and gentlemen, last week we had someone who grew up in Kingston in the Revolutionary period. Well, not last week, 2 weeks ago. And today we have presenters from the Civil War era, and I am happy to introduce you to Don Weber and his wife, Ellen Weber.
Hi. Let me just give you a little background about our organization first. I represent the 14th New Jersey, Company K, which was established in 1992, also in relationship with the 14th Regiment New Jersey Volunteers Living Honor Society. We're a living historian group dedicated to honor soldiers of the Civil War period, as well as education and historical preservation of Civil War period architecture and battlefields. The basic reason that soldiers came together during the Civil War period was, and South Brunswick and New Jersey's involvement in the Civil War, was a manpower situation. There was a desperate need for manpower during the Civil War. The 14th New Jersey was one of the last 3-year units to be recruited out of New Jersey during the Civil War period. We were recruited in 1862. A lot of the names associated with the unit and the South Brunswick area are Conivers, Perrines, Stouts, Stoltz, Hoagland, So the families involved in South Brunswick, and because South Brunswick was such a crossroads of not only the American Revolution but also of the Civil War, because of its access to the railroads. Company K was recruited and basically rendezvoused in New Brunswick. The person I portray, Captain Jacob J. Janeway, was an alumni of Rutgers University. Because of his educational background, was probably the reason why he became captain in Company K. He, along with members of the Army, recruited in New Brunswick area, which would pool manpower from the South Brunswick area. Farmers, hunters, people that knew how to use weapons. They were prime, so to speak, targets for organizations and regiments to recruit from. Company K was very active during the Civil War, and I'll get into that a little further. But Company K rendezvoused in the New Brunswick area. So I'm assuming that a lot of soldiers that came out of the South Brunswick area would have gotten onto trains, would have been loaded onto trains. There may have been a recruiting post in the Deans Dayton area, and from that point they shipped them to New Brunswick, where they would join a full company, which was roughly 100 men at the time, to be trained and drilled. And then when the regiment was finally formed, which came together at Camp Vredenburg in Freehold, New Jersey, they would be shipped from New Brunswick down to Freehold, probably via the same railroad system, where they would join the rest of their command, which would be 1,000 men.
Keep in mind, Camp Vredenburg is actually Monmouth Battlefield right now. Okay, it was a part of Monmouth Battlefield. All right, so that was mentioned earlier by Joan when she mentioned Monmouth Battlefield in Freehold, New Jersey.
A lot of what developed during the Civil War was based on railroads. So being a railroad community, such as South Brunswick, Deans, Dayton was, it's logical that these railroads, the railroads in this area, were a very viable point of entry and access for Civil War, the needs of the Civil War. So the men would gather in either Deans or Dayton, be shipped to New Brunswick. The rendezvous down there were located near railroads in New Brunswick. The training grounds and stuff were located near railroads or within close marching distance of railroads. And Camp Vredenburg is right near the railroad. So that was a very viable way to maneuver troops, especially large numbers. You're talking hundreds, thousands of troops. And when you get into more regiments, you just multiply 1,000 by however many regiments you're moving at the time. And these are average numbers. So that's one of the things that South Brunswick contributed to, or parts that South Brunswick contributed to the Civil War. The other part is the staples, food, your apples were needed and supplied to the troops, because these troops, when they got to a camp, there was very, very little there to sustain themselves. Everything had to be shipped in. So the railroads, again, would bring in a lot of these supplies.
Now, there were two companies from Middlesex County. There was Company H and Company K. Those both came from the Middlesex County area. Company H was more the Cranberry area, but Company K encompassed New Brunswick, North Brunswick, South Brunswick, Kingston. That was all part of Company K, and that's one of the reasons we started to reenact as the 14th New Jersey Company K because of the fact that it had come from our hometown. Don actually was raised over on Ridge Road in Monmouth Junction. I grew up at the border of Deans and Dayton. My grandmother's house was actually 2 houses down from Crossroads School. It is a Civil War era house. The main part of it is Civil War era. It was added onto. My grandmother came here when she was 18 years old. She died at the age of 88. Her maiden name was Rudman. My family lived behind my grandmother's house. My maiden name is Hayjack. And we moved to Dean's Lane when I was about 8 years old. So that gives you a little bit of a history of where we are from and where the regiment actually came from.
And my family's involvement during the Civil War period, my grandfather was a blacksmith, not a blacksmith, a gunsmith, and my great-grandfather had a farm in the area, and you know, they worked on weapons during and after the Civil War period. So the family connections, which is a very vital part of this whole thing, is very tight. The Webbers were from the Deans area. Weber's TV and Appliance, many of you may know. It was several stores during the course of its heritage. I know there was a gunsmith shop in there at one time. There was a watchmaker shop in there at one time. There was a candy store, a gas station, and it eventually developed into the TV and appliance business. So there's a great heritage there. The front part of the building at one time was the toll booth for King George's Road. So there's a lot of heritage in the South Brunswick, and one of the main reasons why my wife and I got involved in Civil War specifically was so that we could educate people in the Civil War and help people to relive history. And that is, I find it is the best way of education. You haven't really lived until you can step back in time, and which is what we do on numerous occasions. As soon as I put on this uniform, I step back into my persona, and I step back into the mindset of the people during that time period. The thinking was very simple at the time. When I'm at events and so on and so forth, I hardly ever look at my watch, except if there's something going on that I need to keep track of time. But when you're at an event, especially in the evening, time means nothing. And it's pretty much the way things were back then. Time didn't mean too much to them. All I knew was when the sun came up and when the sun came down, when the sun set. That was pretty much it. And everything in between was basically labor intensive.
Let me tell you a little bit about the commander of the 14th New Jersey, Captain Janeway. He was married to a young lady by the name of Eliza Harrington Janeway. She was from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. They married in November of 1871. And that is the person I portray. Unfortunately, she wasn't married to him during the Civil War, so we kind of are a little out of our element there. Captain Janeway was the commander of the Company K. He is buried in New Brunswick at Elmwood Cemetery. But also, across from the Slack Carroll House, if you go into the old cemetery that's there is one soldier buried there from the 14th New Jersey. I believe the gentleman's name is Davidson. And we have been there on several occasions to place a flag at his grave. And that's another part of what we do. But that is a soldier that was in South Brunswick, was in the Dayton area, that was buried there from the Civil War. So that Dayton it didn't actually have a battle, and it didn't have really any heritage as far as that goes, but what its heritage was is that its soldiers came from there. And the 14th New Jersey Company K holds a very distinct honor because it was called, in the beginning of the war, Uncle Sam's Rebellion Smashers. We had nicknames. We did a battle in Monocacy, Maryland, and it's called the Battle of Monocacy. It's also called the Battle that Saved Washington. 14th New Jersey and its members, who of course were made up from Dayton and Dean's area as well as New Brunswick, were responsible for holding off Confederate troops for 2 to 3 hours so that reinforcements could make it to Washington, D.C. in order to hold off the Confederates. When the Confederates reached Washington, D.C., when they broke through Monocacy, they thought they were going to be up against new recruits. They thought they were going to have an easy run in, take over Washington, and be on their way, and that would be the end of the war. Unfortunately, when they reached there, because of the 14th New Jersey and its valiant men, they came up against seasoned veterans and regiments of seasoned veterans.
From the Army of the Potomac.
And upon seeing this, they turned around and headed back to Virginia. So the 14th New Jersey received an honor for being one of the regiments that held off these Confederate troops. There is a monument down in Monocacy, Maryland, that was placed there by the state of New Jersey. And you can see it on our flyer over here. It was placed there by the state of New Jersey in honor of the 14th New Jersey for their meritorious battle in Monocacy, Maryland. The other thing that they hold a distinction for is that the 14th New Jersey was actually at the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. It was one of the regiments that was there. So you have a lot of heritage as far as your soldiers, but no battles in South Brunswick, or no battles, you know, having to do with South Brunswick. But your members and your soldiers had battles out of the state, but they were honored for their battles because of the battles that they fought and their heritage and the winning of those battles and what they accomplished in those battles. So there's where your heritage comes in for Dayton and Dean's. It's actually in the men and in the names. It's not really in a battle.
The difficult part through research is, and especially during the Civil War period, is that records are very confused and very confusing. So the documentation, like my wife mentioned, the Battle of Monocacy, it was a day-long battle, but by the time Washington found out what was going on, the battle itself was almost over. So the communications and stuff was very sporadic. The lineages to ancestors of the 14th New Jersey and South Brunswick are very loose and very sporadic that we've found because of the amount of engagements that the 14th was involved in. These men were lost in battle, killed in battle, wounded, shipped anywhere. A lot of them stayed in Frederick, Maryland after the Battle of Monocacy. Some of them were shipped to other places. Some went to Washington. So it's very difficult and very difficult for us to find what families from South Brunswick tied directly to the 14th New Jersey, because a lot of them may not have made it back to South Brunswick. They may have been buried somewhere else, you know, in national cemeteries, so on and so forth.
Or where they fell.
Yeah, or where they fell in battle. So the amount of soldiers, and as undeveloped as a South Brunswick was at that point in time, the communities may not have had a means to bring these soldiers back. And you know, a lot of these are farmers and farm families and stuff. They may have not have had the means to bring their family members back.
You have to remember, back in that time period, we didn't
help
have
them.
embalming. We weren't able to hold a body for 5 or 6 days like you can now, or months. We actually probably had about a day and a half with the heat to bring a body back. So you didn't have much time. It was very difficult. One of my relatives actually was killed. He was in 20th New York, and his body was shipped back. But when it got back here, according to the paperwork, it was not able to be viewed. It had to be buried immediately. So you didn't have a lot of time to do that. To give you a little bit more, you were talking about Abraham Lincoln before, and you were talking about maybe the heritage with Abraham Lincoln. One of the things I do know about Abraham Lincoln was that he did pass through here. I don't know if any of you are aware, but over in Jamesburg, there's a house called the Bucklew House. And if you go there, there's a coach, and it's called the Lincoln Coach, and there's a reason for that. Mr. Bucklew loaned that coach to Abraham Lincoln pre-inaugural to ride to Trenton And in doing so, he had passed through South Brunswick on the Lincoln Highway to get to Trenton. It's a very interesting coach. If you ever get a chance to go over and see it, please do. And there's a big story about it and about what happened to it. It was sent to Trenton, and it was actually put in the monkey cage. Nice, they took care of our heritage well. It was taken apart, and the Historical Society there found it, brought it back, refurbished it. It was in a barn, and the barn, about a week after the coach was removed, burned down. So we almost lost that piece of heritage as well. But it did go through South Brunswick on its way. So Abraham Lincoln did go past through here. I don't think he stopped. It wasn't George Washington stopped here or Abraham Lincoln stopped here. But he did ride through here on the coach in order to get to Trenton. So there is a little bit of heritage with Abraham Lincoln. And that would have probably been the Dayton area that he would have gone through. Because the Bucklew House is over on the main street in Jamesburg. So he would have come through and then gone probably down the Ridge Road area and out to 27 and on his way. Sure.
You had some personal family members in. Also, I believe you have some artifacts that have tell us a little bit about those.
My family member that was in the Civil War was actually in the 20th New York. His name was Rudolph Dahl. His brother was also in the Civil War. His name was Henry Dahl. Henry died at Fort Monroe, Virginia, and his body was shipped back home. Rudolph Dahl went on to survive the war. From paperwork I have, it says that he was actually in the Secret Service under Abraham Lincoln and was with Abraham Lincoln at the White House. But other paperwork that I get says that he was very feeble and couldn't do that. So it's very confusing because I've spoken to people who have said that it's possible that the paperwork was fudged because of the fact that he was in the Secret Service and they didn't want that to be known. So there could be anything at this point on that. One of the documents that I have is that when my grandmother found out that I was getting involved in the Civil War, she had said to me, in the top of my closet, I have this book and I don't know what it is, but it has to do with something in the Civil War. Why don't you take it? And she brought it down, and it wound up being a 1907 Leslie book of prints of the Civil War, and it's famous commanders and battles of the Civil War. And in it is actually the camp of the 20th New York, which was my uncle's group. So we have some artifacts on that. I also have his crossed cannons. I have a couple of JAR ribbons that belong to him. I have some pictures of him when he was 90 years old. I have several other items. I can't remember all of them at this point. His belt buckle from the Civil War. So there are quite a few artifacts that my family has held on to. I haven't been able to speak to the other side of my family, which are the Dahls, to find out if there was anything left of a uniform or anything of that such case. A lot of them have died. They're up in their 90s, so a lot of them have passed on. And what their families have done with anything, we don't know.
And coincidentally, the commander of the 20th New York was Max Weber.
We're trying to find out.
We're trying to find whether there's any direct lineage there. But I do have Max Weber's records. I got those from the archives in Washington, D.C. There doesn't seem to be any direct relationship, but you don't know.
Right. The other thing I wanted to mention was that Don's grandfather, who had owned the gunsmithing shop, actually had a gun come in, which he was able to purchase, which is a very rare piece. It's actually a revolving Colt rifle, which there are not many of, and we've been told it's quite rare, and that is in the family. It's a piece of heritage that's in the family and held on to. It's an unusual piece.
Colt revolving rifles, there's several styles of revolving rifles during that time period. They were mainly used by sharpshooters. I talked to people from the Colt Museum, and the piece that we have seems to be one that would have been used for military use rather than for hunting or anything like that. So, it's very fond memories there. It's something I will cherish for my life.
I wanted to also let you know the outfit I'm wearing today is not something that I would have worn when I was here in South Brunswick in the Civil War. This, I would have worn it if I was going to a tea or to a party. But for the most part, being the agricultural area that we were, my husband would have been away. I probably would have been in something that was very tight to my arms, very tight down the front of me, and I would have been out in the fields working or in the house baking. This was more of an attire that would have been for a tea, and we have other attires which were for ball gowns. A lot of people will say to me, well, I understand that you guys slept mostly during the day. And I look at them and I go, no, I'm from the north. That was the South. The South actually did that. The southern states, the ladies would sleep in the hottest times of the day. Your dinner and your balls that they held were not held until later in the evening, in the coolest part of the day. But here in the north, I would have been in the fields working because, of course, my husband would have been a farmer or a hunter, and there would have been duties that had to be done at home. And with him gone, it would be me, and I would have to sustain myself. So I would be out in the fields, I would be doing the gardening, I would be doing the chickens, I would be doing the cows, I would be doing whatever I needed to do to survive. So I would not have been wearing this type of an outfit. This would only be to visit. If I was visiting a friend who was having company or tea, then I would wear this kind of an outfit.
The soldiers that were involved in the Civil War, there were two very distinct makeups. The Southern soldiers were more proficient at weapons because they were primarily hunters, some farmers, but not more hunting oriented than the Northern soldiers. Most of the Northern soldiers are from the city, high commerce areas. They were Captain Janeway before he was involved in the Civil War. He worked in New York. So a lot of the soldiers and stuff, or a lot of the people that came from this area may have worked in New York for, Janeway worked for a pharmaceutical company, or what they called a drug company at the time. Bookbinders, mostly merchant-oriented type people. South Brunswick was unique because it had farmers and hunters and that kind of stuff. So it gave Company K a leg up on maybe some of the other companies. And Company K was one of the more distinctive companies of the 14th New Jersey. I haven't found documentation to back it up, but it seems that Company K was more of a skirmish-oriented company, which meant they were in the front lines a lot, ascertaining positions of the rebel forces or Confederate forces, using their hunting abilities and their marksman abilities to best suit the overall regiment. You want your finest shooters up in the front. You want to get, you want to get your opposition before they get you, and that was just military logistics at the time, which is my forte. I studied in military logistics more than a lot of the historical aspects. Questions? Any other questions?
Does anyone have a question that they would like to ask?
No, a proper lady would never show anything.
That's right.
Later, maybe. No, actually, during that time period, ladies were not allowed to show anything from their neck down to their toes, unless they were with their husbands, and the only time they were allowed to do that was with a ball gown, and this was the only area they were allowed to show. Unless you were not well-bred. If you were not well-bred, then you could show anything you wanted to. However, I'm a well-bred lady. Liza Harrington came from a prominent family, and she would never have done that. Maybe later, though.
Soldiers of the time period were also well attired. In heat situations, it would have been appropriate for a soldier or a gentleman to what they call unblouse, and that was unbuttoned from anything from here on down, but you must maintain the top button. Would not be considered appropriate if your collar was exposed. So that's why you would keep things, your top button, and a tie.
There were very strict rules.
Yes.
Very strict rules, even for
Victorian was
teas and for applauding. Ladies did not applaud. That was not proper. You did not clap your hands. You took a handkerchief and you waved it. That was applauding for you during that time period. There was fan language. There was certain fan language that if you were a single young lady, you could tell a gentleman you'd like to meet him later. There were certain ways. There was brushing of the cheek, brushing of the nose, fanning fast, fanning slow, a combination. There was a whole different language during that time period than there is today. I mean, today's period, you can walk up to a gentleman and say, hello, how are you? I'd like to take you out. During that time period, you wouldn't do that. That was not how you did things. You would do it all with your fan language.
And the way you kissed a woman's hand.
Oh, yes.
There's also hand etiquette. There are certain ways to kiss a woman's hand which would be appropriate, and there are certain ways to kiss a woman's hand that would not be appropriate.
And the woman had the choice. It was, if you kissed in front of the knuckle, it was appropriate. If you went to kiss on the top of the hand, the woman had the choice of either allowing you to do that, and it was a proposition, or pulling her hand away and telling you no thank you. So that there's a whole different language during the Victorian period, and we have to research this and study this in order to do it in the field. And we have several people who try to kiss up higher than they should, and they catch you at times. It's an education being out there. It really is.
This commander is one of the people that tries to catch some of the female reenactors off guard. I will also make note to them that they're not appropriate.
The other thing too is women were regarded very high. If you've ever heard the word putting a woman on a pedestal, that was the Victorian era time period. Women were treated very well. Men took off their coats, put them across the puddles for the women to walk across. They tipped their hats going down the street. They kissed the hands. It was a very, very romantic time period, as well as a very tragic time period.
And the men would also walk usually to the inside of the roadway
Yes.
to protect the women's fancy attire from being splashed by horses or carriages or stuff like that.
And also runaway carriages. The man would actually guard the woman from having some kind of an accident happen to her. He would take it before she would.
Very different time period.
Different time period.
Don and Ellen, thank you so very much for giving us your time today. Thank you. Well, today we've gone from Native American to agricultural development of early settlers, to Victorian homes, to Sears homes, and more. And it's been quite a ride. I thank Dr. Ilnicki and Dr. Luckhart and Don and Ellen Weber so very much for what you have given us today on a volunteer basis, I want you to know. And I'm sure that we have grown much. I know I have. And I just can't thank you enough. I also would like to remind you and our listeners that we are doing a series on South Brunswick's history, and while each presentation is different because each of our areas is different, we are part of a whole. We are part of South Brunswick Township, and all of the parts make us what we are. On May 6th, we're going to have Dennis Farrelly and Ruth Spataro explain to us how Monmouth Junction came into being and what its character was and how it came to be what it is today. That's Sunday, May 6th. It's only 2 weeks from now. And then on Sunday, June 3rd, we're going to do the last part of our history, which is the development of Kendall Park area of South Brunswick. And I have spoken with David Savage, who is the architect builder of Kendall Park Estates, and he is willing to have me come to his home and interview him, and I'm sure that will be very interesting too. And it is a part of history, because it was the beginning of suburban America when Kendall Park Estates, along with Levittown and other similar developments, came into being after the Second World War. Frank Reganey has offered to help too by telling us the history of Little Rocky Hill, and it has its own character. Very interesting. I hope you'll join us once and again. And again, thank you very, very much for coming. And John, thank you. And Tasso, thank you.